We were going to continue on with our next speaker. Vinny, are you there?
Yep, I'm here.
Oh, welcome. Major United States Army. It is a 48 Bravo, is that correct?
Yep.
Excellent, excellent. Western Hemisphere Foreign Area Officer, if I'm not mistaken. Awesome, awesome. And you've been doing design thinking for a couple years now. So you really enjoy it, much like most of us do. Without further ado, though, I'm going to let you go ahead and take control and share your stories.
Okay. Hey, everybody. Thanks. I have to say it's kind of an honor to be on this panel with a bunch of people that have a lot of experience. So I would consider myself more of a novice when it comes to applying this. But what I'd like to talk about today is kind of a case study, one situation where I applied it where I currently work, which is the InterAmerican Defense College, and kind of the lessons I learned there. So let me share my screen. Okay. So kind of what you can think about is the way our college is set up. The InterAmerican Defense College is essentially an organization. It's a school. It offers a master's degree in Inter-American Defense and Security. We belong to the Organization of American States. We're part of an organization called the Inter-American Defense Board. You can kind of consider this like a NATO equivalent. So in the Western Hemisphere, you have the OAS and the Inter-American Defense Board, and then in Europe, you have NATO. And so I'm part of the U.S. element that works at the college. And so the two elements that kind of play into how we operate are obviously DoD and then accrediting standards. You know, as you look at our breakout, it's essentially extremely complex because not only is it 4 different types of personnel that work at the college, they speak different languages, and we really function in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. But our degree is delivered in French as well. So there's a necessity to interact with diplomats and representatives from the Organization of American States that speak French. And so the reason why we applied design thinking was essentially because I was working inside of the group that was trying to begin the process of accreditation with Middle States. And so Middle States is a regional accreditor. So, you know, if you go to Georgetown, they're regionally accredited by Middle States Commission on Higher Education. And so it's a distinct difference in what they're asking us to do from previous accreditors. Much more rigid, very, very much focused on English, and a certain type of process that is not really relatable in other countries. And we're on a defined timeline dealing with the constraint of personnel that switch out from serving once a year at a very high rate. And so they have to get comfortable with the language, get comfortable with their job, but they've got to jump right into the middle of this Middle States process. And so the overall concept for what we did kind of follows. I'll be honest. I've got to thank John Hawley, who some of you may know him. I had attended a session with him where he was facilitating a workshop, and he did that using design thinking, and I was hooked. And so, kind of looking at ideas setup, I tried to do something similar for the college with John's help. And so really what was underpinning our goal was to create a shared narrative for the issue of accreditation, but identifying all the friction points that we would have. And so, you know, to the point about getting people on board, I had to pitch just doing an exercise to the accreditation project lead and then the director of the college, who's a 2-star general. And so what I didn't know at the time was that my boss is he's a strategist by trade, and so he was all about it. So having senior leader support is critical. So anyway, we designed this exercise essentially to conduct a bit of inspiration, and by that I mean we shook up the stiff environment of formal military rigidity. So even though we have different civilians, agencies, and services, I mean it's a very distinctly a military college in a lot of ways. And so then what I wanted to do was go through a short self-expression session, which had the divergent thinking, followed by convergent thinking, which was facilitator led by myself. And luckily enough, I had a Canadian officer who was on board. He thought just like I did, again, to the point of not focusing on rank. He was a lieutenant colonel. I'm a major. There was no issue. It was first name basis how we worked. And all that was to set people up prior to getting into the working groups, which was going to be led by the accreditation lead. And so this is a short exercise, but I originally had 40 minutes to do this, and then I was cut down to 15. So, all that to say is be flexible, be like Gumby, right? And so the exercise began with an icebreaker exercise. And so understanding that essentially everybody spoke different languages, I gave everyone about 30 seconds, and that wasn't a hard time, but I gave everybody about 30 seconds to describe their life story. And the one rule was, of course, it's not work focused. But they didn't, and so each aisle inside of the auditorium was set up with each working group that eventually would go to a room later on to work on the project. And so they spent that time just getting to know each other, and they were all familiar with each other, but this was extremely uncomfortable for them. And that was the goal. The goal was to put them in a space where they weren't used to doing this. You can see 2 stars in the front talking. I mean, he was used to it, but the rest of the staff was kind of unaware of what was going on, and that was by design. And that helped facilitate the breakdown of the initial apprehension of the middle states process in general. And so the next exercise, the next part of this was the thought exercise. And the way we did this was by having everybody think of 2 questions, but I split the room down the middle, and I had one answer, what are the IDC's greatest strengths, purposely broad, and what are the IDC's greatest challenges? Again, purposefully broad. So that in that way, I could capture 2 things. I could capture what their response was, but then also get an understanding of what they were thinking. Because I asked the questions in both English and Spanish, and essentially everybody receives it differently. And so that was the goal with this part of the exercise. And so they got about 5 to 7 minutes to write their answers, and then we had them come up. And so they would come up, they would post their sticky note on the board, and then they would explain what they were thinking about. And so this really, and it was facilitated by the Canadian officer who you'll see on the far right. And so what this really did was a lot of the personnel at the school, understanding who my audience was, a lot of the personnel at the school don't want to stand up in front of the general and talk out loud. And so the fact that this was a forced exercise made all the difference in the world. And so this put out kind of what we suspected in terms of what we thought they would say. Things like the greatest strengths are the diversity and the greatest challenges are communication. But it got everybody thinking about it on the same terms. And so for folks who didn't know English or didn't know Spanish or didn't know Portuguese, they were kind of engaging each other to help understand what it meant, and that created a shared understanding of what was going on. And so, it is a short vignette, essentially to identify that it was a success for us. The short exercise ended up causing a paradigm shift in the way that they thought which put them in a successful end state where they kind of knew who they were going to work with. They knew what every other team was going to work on, and every other team had to work on a different aspect of what the accreditation process was, but they were all coming from the same starting point. And so in terms of an international context, I mean, no matter how complex the interests are or how varied the backgrounds are, this type of exercise truly facilitates coming to one page about what you think the problem is. Inducing comfort is probably the most important tool that I found in this process, because if it's facilitated properly, then you take them from that discomfort to understanding and a shared understanding. And then this iteration kind of helped the working groups work better together, because they understood that this was something that they weren't aware of before. And yes. It helped create a shared understanding that then informed their subsequent processes. But inside of the context of an international event, in the context of an international organization, really, we saw these things. I mean, the individual biases are key. Coming down from what background they have, how they grew up, socioeconomic level informs how they answer questions, to cultural biases that are prevalent for certain countries or certain parts of the region, to institutional biases that, it talks, that would describe whether they're army, military, civilian, what have you. And then the language limitations. Those can be overcome. It does require, though, on the part of the facilitator, a capability to speak more than one language, because you've got to understand the nuance of what people are asking in order to get to the ground truth about what they're trying to say, and then put that in the context for the rest of the audience. And then, iterative requirements. I wish we could have done this more times than that. But all in all, it was a short exercise that worked out really well for the college. And so the follow-on was that for me personally, I ended up leaving the accreditation group. So I had wanted to continue this process for the Middle States accreditation, but I ended up going to work for the director, and it was beneficial because now, from his level, we use design thinking for solving strategic problems at the college. So that's kind of the broad overview of kind of what we did and how it worked out.
Appreciate that information, Vinny, and sharing your stories and your successes with it. Certainly with sounds like some language barriers there, and getting over those. Worked in environments before where it's like, I can see that being a very useful tool, and trying to break that barrier right down with the language barrier. So that was a great point. I definitely took note on that. Appreciate it. I think we have a couple questions here. We have a few minutes left of time for you if you want to take a couple questions. Let's see. We have a.
So the first one is
with language variation between working jointly.
Yeah, that's significant. It ran the gamut of, we're heavily Army, but also, we're heavily military, and that's spread pretty evenly across Air Force. So let me rephrase that. So across all countries that serve on the staff, which is about 15 to 17 at any given point in time, mostly end up being Army, a good amount Air Force, and a good amount Navy. And, by exception, we do have Marines. But yes, so within the service across countries, the language is very similar. But across services, across countries, there's a lot that you have to translate. And then you have the police, because in Latin America, there's a significant number of countries that don't have a military, and so their police force is kind of their defense force. And so So there's a lot of learning in that context, apart from the diplomats that serve on the staff and the government civilians, not just from the U.S., but from other countries that serve on the staff that have a completely different, lingo.
Appreciate that. I think that kind of answers that one up. And we have one from Susan, an opportunity to work at a Portuguese shipyard through the Blue Tech Accelerator. Are you aware of any avenues available through the international forces for?
That is kind of the way that something like that could happen is if we talk offline. So at the college we focus strictly on the education of these member states that come to get a degree in the U.S. But for something like that, which is more operational, we'd push that back to the delegations that are in the U.S.
Good to go. Hey, well, Vinny, I thank you for being on. Appreciate the presentation and the information. Definitely showed some great things in there. Hopefully a lot of people learned some things and some new tools to move forward with. Appreciate you.
Thanks for having me on.